In a futuristic world where intergalactic rulers and their alien children walk among humans, one simple gesture changes everything. As the alien queen of destruction watches, a human single dad, just a regular man with an extraordinary task, combs the wild hair of her child, a moment that leaves even the most fearsome monarch frozen in awe. The power of tenderness transcends the stars, leaving the queen's icy exterior shattered. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories that combine the unexpected with the extraordinary, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more mind-blowing than this one. The hum of the ship was constant, a soft vibration that matched the pulse of starlight streaming through the thick windows. Inside the quarters, walls of metal and glowing alien technology blended with the warmth of humanity, a warmth Lucas had grown to cherish. The room was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt heavy, as if the very air held its breath. Lucas, a man used to quiet moments of solitude, sat at a simple table, combing the hair of the alien princess. The child, with purple skin and vibrant eyes, stared up at him, her silver hair wild but soft under his touch. Every stroke of the comb felt like a bridge between worlds, between the human heart and the cosmic unknown. The child's gaze never left him, as if she were learning something she hadn't known she needed. Her small hand rested on the table, fingers curling around it, as if the connection between them made her feel safe, grounded. In the quiet of the room, Lucas felt the weight of his role settle more than ever. It was simple: comb her hair, care for her, but in that simple act was more responsibility than he had ever known. Behind him, the queen watched in silence. Her tall, armored figure cast a long shadow across the room, her eyes cold and unreadable. The alien armor shimmered with shifting hues, reflecting the starlight in mesmerizing ways, but her focus was solely on the human father before her. She had seen many things in her life: power, destruction, the rise and fall of empires, but she had never witnessed this, a simple, human act of tenderness, so raw and pure that it cut through the walls she had built around herself. Lucas finished combing the child's hair and smiled down at her, a soft, genuine expression. "There, all done," he said, his voice quiet but full of warmth. He met the queen's gaze then, unsure of how to break the silence. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" he asked, the words filled with a truth he didn't even realize he was speaking. The queen's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Her eyes locked onto the scene before her, the child, so innocent and trusting, and the human father, so full of care. Something shifted in her chest, something deep and unfamiliar. She had everything: power, control, sovereignty over life and death. But in that moment, she realized that there was something her kingdom had never given her: a simple, human connection. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and hidden emotions. The queen didn't move, still as the stone floors beneath her feet. Her eyes, once sharp and unyielding, now seemed to soften, their violet hue flickering like a dying star. She was a being of immense power, her presence enough to make entire civilizations tremble. Yet in that moment, she stood frozen, struck by a tenderness she had never known. Lucas glanced up, meeting her gaze. He couldn't understand what had just happened, why the queen, the ruler of so many, had been so still, so quiet. But he felt it too, the weight of the moment, the strange bond that had formed between him, the child, and this towering alien monarch. He wasn't a hero. He was just a father trying to do right by a child who wasn't his. But that didn't stop him from feeling like he was in the middle of something far greater than himself. "Is she safe?" Lucas asked cautiously, his voice breaking the silence. His hand hovered over the child's tiny head, still unsure whether he had overstepped his bounds. The queen's presence loomed over him like an eternal shadow. The queen's eyes flickered, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. Her kingdom, her empire, had always been ruled by strength. Her word was law. And yet, here was this human, small and fragile, taking care of her most precious possession with a tenderness that made her wonder whether she had been wrong about so many things. The child, oblivious to the complexities of their conversation, reached up, tugging at Lucas's sleeve. Her touch was soft, innocent. In that moment, She seemed like any other child in the galaxy, curious, trusting, and in need of protection. Lucas smiled, brushing the child's hand away gently, but her gaze never wavered. She needed him, just as much as he needed her. The Queen stepped forward, her armored feet making no sound on the metal floor. She was taller than Lucas by nearly 2 heads, a towering figure of alien beauty and terrifying grace. Yet there was a vulnerability in her eyes that wasn't there before. She had watched her empire crumble, seen her people fall into disarray, and had spent lifetimes gathering power. But in this moment, she felt something more human than she had ever felt before. "I did not expect this," she finally said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You care for her as if she were your own." Lucas didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't the one who needed to hear it. It was the Queen who needed to hear it. So, he simply nodded, the weight of his words settling into the space between them. The child tugged at his sleeve again, pulling him from his thoughts, and he gave her another soft smile, unaware of the shift taking place in the Queen's heart. The Queen's gaze lingered on Lucas, her thoughts spinning in a storm of contradictions. She had once believed that power was the ultimate form of control, that dominance over others was the only true strength. Yet, in the quiet intimacy of this small room, something had shifted. She couldn't deny the strange pang in her chest as she watched the human care for her child. Lucas, meanwhile, was oblivious to the weight of the Queen's scrutiny. He was focused on the child now, gently lifting her into his arms as she squirmed playfully, her laughter a sound that seemed so innocent, so pure, it made the weight of the universe feel distant. He cradled her carefully, his arms strong but tender, as though he were holding something precious because to him she was. The Queen's silence stretched on, but it was no longer the stony silence of a ruler unchallenged. It was something softer, more contemplative. She crossed the room slowly, her movements deliberate, yet oddly hesitant. She had never felt hesitation before. It was an alien emotion to her, something she had long since abandoned in her rise to power. And yet here she was, standing at the edge of something she didn't understand, something that made her question everything she had ever known. "What do you want from this?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. There was no anger in her tone, just a raw curiosity, a desire to understand this strange human and his quiet devotion. Lucas looked up at her, surprised by the question. His hands stilled on the child for a moment before he spoke, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his answer. "I don't want anything from this," he said simply. "I'm just doing what any father would do. She's not mine by blood, but she's still someone I care for. I can't turn my back on her." The Queen blinked, as if his words had struck her like a physical blow. She had never thought of herself as a mother in the truest sense. She had been a protector, a ruler, a figurehead of immense power. But she had never known love in the way Lucas spoke of it, not in the way he cared for her child, not in the way that he, a simple man, could give so much of himself without expectation. Her gaze softened, just slightly, and for the first time, she felt something akin to gratitude for this human who had unknowingly opened her eyes to the simple, undeniable truth that had eluded her for so long. She didn't know what the future held, whether her empire would crumble, whether she would be the ruler her people needed, or whether the galaxy would find peace. But one thing was certain in that moment. Her child had found a protector, a caretaker who would love her without question. And for that, the Queen would be eternally grateful. The room felt smaller now, the weight of their words and actions pressing down on everyone within it. Lucas, still cradling the child, felt the shift in the air. Something had changed. He wasn't sure when or how, but it was undeniable. The Queen, a towering presence of power and destruction, had softened in a way he couldn't quite explain. Her posture, once rigid and unyielding, now held a trace of something else, uncertainty perhaps, or wonder. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the child's soft breathing, her small hand resting gently against Lucas's chest, as if sensing the shift in the room as well. The Queen's eyes flicked from Lucas to her child, the silence between them growing thick with unspoken questions. Lucas finally broke it, his voice quiet, but carrying a strength that felt almost out of place in such a delicate moment. "You're not as terrifying as you make yourself out to be." The words were simple, but they hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The queen's gaze sharpened instantly, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. She was not used to being spoken to this way, not by her people, not by anyone. She had been feared, revered, and obeyed for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to be treated as something less than an unapproachable monarch. "I am the Queen of Destruction," she said, her voice low but not without a trace of vulnerability. "My people fear me. They respect me, and they should." Lucas met her eyes, his expression steady, though his heart pounded. "Respect is one thing, but fear?" He shook his head slightly, the child in his arms shifting her weight, unaware of the tension in the room. "Fear doesn't create real loyalty. It just makes people bow. It doesn't make them trust." The queen's jaw tightened at his words, but she didn't speak. Instead, she simply watched him, her gaze piercing, but softer now, as though she were seeing him for the first time, not as a mere human, but as a man who, in the simplest of actions, had done something she never thought possible. The child stirred, breaking the heavy silence. She reached out, her tiny fingers brushing against the queen's armored hand. The queen's eyes softened as she looked down at her daughter, who now gazed up at her with unbridled trust. It was the same trust that Lucas had shown her, that simple, unquestioning faith in something beyond power. The queen didn't know how long they stood there, locked in that strange, fragile moment of shared understanding. But when she spoke again, her voice was different, less regal, less commanding, more like a woman who had seen something deeper than the surface of her world. "I never thought," she began, her words trailing off as she looked at the child in Lucas's arms. She cleared her throat, then spoke again, this time with more certainty. "Perhaps there is more to this world than destruction." Lucas gave a small nod, his expression soft but knowing. "Maybe, but you'll never know until you let something else in." The queen's gaze lingered on him, her mind churning with the weight of his words. She didn't know if she was ready to change, but for the first time in her life, she felt the possibility of it. The queen stood motionless, her gaze unwavering as she studied Lucas and her child. There was a depth in her eyes now, a flicker of something she had long suppressed. Power had been her constant companion for so long, but in this moment she was face to face with something more profound, more human than she had ever known. Lucas, for his part, remained steady. He hadn't expected this shift, hadn't expected to see the Queen of Destruction so vulnerable. But there it was, a crack in the ice. He wasn't sure if it was the child or his simple act of care that had brought it out, but something inside him knew that this moment would linger. The child, sensing the shift in the air, squirmed in Lucas's arms and giggled softly, her tiny fingers reaching for the queen's armored hand once more. The queen hesitated, looking down at her daughter, before lowering herself to one knee. The movement was slow, calculated, but there was no denying the gentleness in her approach. "Do you trust me?" the queen asked, her voice softer than Lucas had ever heard it. It wasn't a command, not a demand, it was a question, and one that carried with it a weight Lucas could not ignore. Lucas shifted the child in his arms, allowing her to reach out toward the queen. "She does," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. "I think she trusts you more than you know." The queen's gaze softened as she watched her child reach for her. The child's trust was unspoken, a pure expression of belief in something she couldn't yet understand, something that transcended the walls built around the queen's heart. The queen's gloved fingers brushed lightly against the child's small hand, a soft touch that lingered longer than she intended. For a brief moment, the queen allowed herself to feel the warmth of that connection, the power of it. She had spent so long building walls around herself, around her empire, believing that strength was found only in solitude and control. But now, standing before this simple human man and his child, she saw that there was something else, something stronger, more resilient than the empire she had built. "I never thought this was possible," the queen whispered, her voice barely audible. "To care so freely, so deeply, to trust without hesitation." Lucas nodded, his expression calm but filled with understanding. "That's what makes us human," he said simply. "We don't have to be perfect, and we don't have to be all-powerful. We just have to show up for each other." The queen remained kneeling, her hand still resting on the child's tiny fingers. She wasn't sure what the future would hold. But in this fleeting moment, she understood that power wasn't just about dominance. It was about connection. And perhaps, for the first time, she felt the weight of that truth. The queen slowly rose to her feet, her gaze lingering on the child, then shifting to Lucas. Her mind was a whirlwind, each thought tumbling over the next, unsure of what to hold on to. She had spent so many years conquering, ruling with an iron fist, never allowing herself the luxury of softness. But here, in this room, surrounded by the gentle quiet of the moment, something had shifted. The walls she had so carefully constructed began to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. Lucas noticed the change too, the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was still the queen, still the powerful ruler of galaxies, but now there was something more human about her, something he could relate to. He had seen it before in his own life, how love, in its purest form, could break through even the hardest of hearts. But he wasn't sure if the queen was ready to admit that she could be touched by such things. "I've never been good at this," she said, her voice tinged with something close to vulnerability. "At letting go, at trusting others." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she looked at him not as a servant, not as a mere caretaker of her child, but as an equal. "I've ruled by fear my entire life. It's the only way I've known how." Lucas took a step toward her, his voice steady but kind. "Maybe it's time to try something different. Fear doesn't keep people loyal, it keeps them silent." The queen didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at her child, who was now playing quietly on the floor, her laughter soft and innocent. The child was a reminder of everything the queen had built her empire to protect, and yet, in this moment, she was a reminder of everything the queen had neglected. "Does it really work?" the queen asked almost to herself. "What you say, the love, the trust, does it really make a difference?" Lucas watched her, his gaze calm but filled with understanding. "It does. Maybe not all at once, but over time. It's the small things that add up." The queen nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on her child. She didn't know if she was ready to abandon everything she had built, but in this moment, she understood that there was something beyond power, something more meaningful than control. Perhaps I have been too blind," she whispered, almost as if saying it aloud would make the words real. Lucas didn't say anything. He simply stood there, letting her words hang in the air between them. There was nothing more he needed to say. He had given her the space to see it herself, and for the first time the queen didn't feel the need to defend herself, to prove her strength. For the first time she simply stood vulnerable, human, and uncertain, but also, maybe for the first time, ready to learn. The quiet in the room stretched on, almost uncomfortable in its stillness. The queen's eyes never left her child, who was now humming softly to herself, lost in her own world of innocence and trust. It was a world the queen had never allowed herself to visit, and yet, in the presence of this child, she felt the pull and invitation to something she had buried for far too long. Lucas stood to the side, giving the queen her space. Though his presence was always felt steady, calm, an anchor in the storm of her thoughts. He had no expectations. He wasn't here to change her, to push her into something she wasn't ready for. He was simply here, in the quiet, sharing in the tenderness that he had so easily given. And somehow, that felt like enough. "I've spent my life building walls," the queen murmured, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of isolation. "Walls to protect my people, to protect myself from weakness. I thought it was the only way." Lucas didn't speak at first. Instead, he let her words hang in the air. There was nothing more he could say to convince her. The queen had to see it herself, and he wasn't sure if she was ready to fully embrace what she was feeling. "But now I see," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that all these walls, they've kept me from something far more valuable." She looked up at him, her eyes no longer filled with icy determination, but something softer, more vulnerable. "They've kept me from what truly matters." Lucas finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with the understanding he had learned over the years. "It's never too late to change. We all have walls we've built, some for protection, some for control. But the real strength comes when we choose to let them go." The queen turned away from him then, her gaze fixing on her daughter again, as if the answer she had been seeking had been there all along, in the small, unassuming moments that she had overlooked in her quest for power. The child was still humming, oblivious to the heavy conversation that had taken place around her. The queen stepped forward, slowly, hesitantly. She crouched down beside the child, her hand reaching out to gently brush a strand of silver hair away from the girl's face. The queen's touch was soft, almost reverent, and for a moment it seemed as though time itself had stopped. She wasn't the queen of destruction in this moment. She was simply a mother, reaching out to the only person in the galaxy who had never asked for anything from her but love. "I'm sorry," the queen whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was. Apologizing to herself, perhaps, or her daughter. It didn't matter. The words had to be spoken. Lucas watched in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but also filling him with a quiet sense of hope. He had never expected to see this side of the queen, never expected her to allow herself this vulnerability, but here she was, finally seeing what she had been blind to for so long. It was a small moment, but it was enough to change everything. The room felt quieter now, the weight of the queen's actions lingering in the air like the calm after a storm. For a long time, the queen remained kneeling by her child, her hand gently brushing the girl's hair, her expression a mix of contemplation and something else, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in ages. Peace. It was a foreign concept, one she had always believed was reserved for the weak. But in this moment, it was the only thing that felt real. Lucas stood at the threshold of the room, watching them. He hadn't intruded, hadn't pushed. The queen needed her time. He understood that now more than ever. In the quiet, he could feel the shift in her, subtle but undeniable. It was as if she had let go of something heavy, something she didn't even realize she had been carrying. After a long pause, the queen spoke, her voice still quiet but laced with a newfound certainty. "I never wanted to be weak," she said, her words heavy with the truth that had finally broken through. "I thought that if I showed any vulnerability, I would lose everything." Lucas stepped forward then, his voice gentle but firm. "Vulnerability doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. And that's what your people need, someone who can lead, but also someone they can trust, someone who understands that strength isn't always about power." The queen's eyes met his, a flicker of realization passing between them. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, walls that kept everyone, herself included, at a distance. She had believed that keeping others out would protect her empire. But now, in the quiet of the room, with the hum of the ship surrounding them, she understood. It wasn't about control or domination, it was about connection. "I've never let anyone get close," she said softly, her gaze returning to her daughter. "But maybe it's time I started." Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply watched her, letting the silence speak louder than words. He knew that the queen wasn't just speaking about herself, she was speaking about her people, about the walls that had kept them from ever truly connecting. For the first time, the queen's eyes softened, and she seemed to notice something she had never fully seen before. The child in her arms wasn't just a symbol of her empire. She was a person, a life that needed love and care. And in that moment, the queen realized that her role as a ruler didn't just lie in her ability to conquer. It lay in her ability to protect, to love, to give her people the one thing she had denied herself for so long. "I will try," the queen said, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a conviction that had not been there before. "I will try to be better. For her. For all of them." Lucas gave a small nod, his expression soft, but filled with quiet pride. "It's a start, and that's all anyone can ask for." As the queen looked down at her child, a small, genuine smile tugged at her lips. It was the first time in years that the smile felt real, not forced or calculated. And as she looked back at Lucas, there was something in her eyes, a promise, perhaps that the walls she had spent so long building were finally starting to crumble. The queen stood in the center of the room, her eyes focused on her daughter, who was now playing with a small toy Lucas had given her. The child's laughter filled the space, innocent and carefree. For a moment, The queen allowed herself to simply watch, to feel the warmth that radiated from the small human she had once seen only as a responsibility. But now, she saw her as something irreplaceable, something worth protecting. Lucas, standing off to the side, noticed the change in her. The queen's posture was no longer as rigid as it had been. There was a softness to her now, an openness that hadn't been there before. The walls that had once been her shield were crumbling, and though she didn't know what the future held, there was a sense of calm in her that spoke volumes. "Do you regret it?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Choosing to care, I mean. Letting yourself feel." The queen's eyes flicked to him, a slight furrow in her brow as she considered his question. "Regret?" she repeated softly. "I don't know. It's difficult to say. I've spent my life believing that power and control were the only things that mattered. But now," she paused, her gaze drifting to her child again. "Now, I see that there's more to it. There's more to everything." Lucas nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "There's always more, if we're willing to see it. If we choose to." The queen looked at him then, her eyes studying him with a quiet intensity. She had ruled an empire for centuries, wielded power like a weapon, but in this moment she felt small, vulnerable, in a way she had never allowed herself to be. And yet, there was something freeing in it. For the first time, she wasn't bound by expectations or the weight of the crown. She was simply a woman, a mother, facing a choice. "I've always thought that power was the answer," she said softly, "that if I held on tight enough, I could protect everything. But now I wonder." Her voice trailed off, her mind racing with the possibilities. "Maybe true strength isn't about holding on. Maybe it's about letting go." Lucas watched her carefully, sensing the internal battle she was waging. She had spent so long protecting her empire, her legacy, that she had never considered the possibility that true strength might lie in allowing herself to care for something or someone beyond that. "You can still be powerful," Lucas said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But maybe power looks different now. Maybe it's not about ruling with fear anymore. Maybe it's about protecting with love." The queen's gaze softened as his words sank in. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what letting go might mean. Instead, she was starting to understand that there was a different kind of power she had yet to explore, a power that came from connection, from trust, from the very things she had spent so long denying. "I will choose," the queen said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I will choose a different path, not just for me, but for her, for all of them." As she spoke those words, something shifted within her, a weight lifted. She didn't know what the future would look like, but in that moment, she knew that she was ready to face it unafraid, and with the knowledge that true power had nothing to do with domination. It was about the bonds we create and the love we give. The sun was rising outside the ship's windows, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. The starlight that had filled the quarters just hours ago was fading, replaced by the soft light of a new day. It was a small change, a subtle shift, but it felt significant. For the first time in a long while, the queen didn't feel the weight of the universe pressing down on her. She felt lighter, freer, as though the heavy burden she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. Lucas stood at the window, watching the dawn break. His reflection was faint in the glass, but his presence was unmistakable. Behind him, the queen moved slowly, her footsteps soft, her movements more measured than they had been before. She no longer seemed like the indomitable ruler who had once commanded entire galaxies with a glance. Now, she was simply a mother, a protector, standing at the threshold of something new. "I've never seen the sun rise like this," the queen said quietly, her voice carrying a note of awe. Lucas turned to face her, a small smile on his lips. "Sometimes it's easy to forget what's right in front of us." The queen looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "I spent so much of my life looking outward at what I could conquer, at what I could control, that I forgot to look at the simple things, the things that really matter." The child, now awake and playing at her feet, looked up at the queen, her innocent gaze full of trust. The queen knelt down, her hand resting gently on the child's shoulder. The moment was tender, fleeting, but in it, the queen saw something she hadn't seen before. A future, a life that wasn't defined by power or fear. A life built on love, on connection, on the small, quiet moments that held more significance than any grand victory. "I don't know what comes next," the Queen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I can't do this alone." Lucas stepped closer, his presence steady, unwavering. "You don't have to." She met his gaze, and for the first time in years, she didn't see a subject, a soldier, or a subordinate. She saw a friend, a partner. Together, they stood there, watching the sun rise higher in the sky. The future was uncertain, filled with challenges and unknowns. But for the first time, the Queen wasn't afraid. She had found something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And as the dawn spread across the horizon, she knew that this was just the beginning.